All right, everyone, welcome back for our next topic here in Anatomy and Physiology 1. In this lab presentation, we're going to discuss the skin and the mucous membranes. The skin belongs to one of our body systems known as the integumentary system. And the integumentary system is going to serve as the barrier between the external environment and the internal environment. Additionally, as well as the skin, we're going to have hair, glands, and nails that are also part of the integumentary system. We are just coming off of tissues where we discussed epithelial tissues and connective tissues. So it's very important for us to mention that now we're going to start discussing organ systems that are building upon tissues. Think back to the levels of structural organization. Tissues are going to build upon cells, and body organs are going to build upon the tissues. An organ is composed of one or more type of tissue, and the skin is going to be just that. The skin has two major layers known as the epidermis and the dermis. And the epidermis is the outermost layer that is made up of epithelial tissue, and the dermis is found just below that, and that is made up of connective tissue. Once we have discussed the skin and all of the accessory structures that are contained within it, we're then going to transition to body membranes, which include the serous membranes, the mucous membranes, the cutaneous membrane, as well as the synovial membranes. So without any further introduction, let's get into the concepts here that are related to the integumentary system. So here on this slide, we can see the components of the skin. The outermost layer, as I've mentioned, is known as the epidermis, and the underlying layer is the dermis. We use the prefix epi with the epidermis because this layer lies upon the dermis. And what we'll see is that the epidermis is made up of an epithelial type tissue, and the dermis is made up of a connective tissue. The epidermis is made up of a stratified squamous epithelium, which, as we just learned in the tissue presentation, this means many different layers of flat and irregularly shaped cells. So that stratified squamous is a very protective type of epithelial tissue, so it's very appropriate that that is the type of epithelium that lies on the outside of the body. Now with the dermis, we're going to see that this layer is made up primarily of a dense irregular connective tissue. And we didn't actually discuss dense irregular connective tissue in the tissue presentation. But this is another type of connective tissue that we have, and dense irregular is referring to the fiber arrangement. We also have loose connective tissue that refers to a loose arrangement of fibers. But dense irregular connective tissue has a very dense arrangement of fibers, and those fibers are irregularly oriented. These fibers have an irregular orientation to provide strength in many different directions. As the skin is serving as a barrier, it's important for the skin to be able to be stretched in many different directions. So this, of course, is the most appropriate type of connective tissue, and it makes sense why this type is found here in the dermis. Now, as well as the epidermis and the dermis, we have the different appendages, or accessory structures, that can be found in the skin as well. We'll find that we have two different types of glands, the sudoriferous glands and the sebaceous glands. The sudoriferous are sweat glands and the sebaceous are oil glands. But on top of these, we're also going to have hair and nails that can be found in the skin in certain places. So we're going to break down the skin into its individual components, and we're going to take a look at some sections of the skin under the microscope. We're going to organize the skin into its different sublayers, and by which of these accessory structures that we can find in different places. So just as a little refresher, I real quickly wanted to show you some squamous epithelium. You can see that there are these flat and irregularly shaped cells. They don't really have much uniform shape with each other, and based on the way that we look at these, they're going to look like an egg that's been cracked into a pan. Now on this slide, we're going to see some stratified squamous epithelium, which is multiple layers of flat and irregularly shaped cells. You can see all of these cells are very, very squamous. They're very flat, and they're squished together in many different layers that make this very thick epithelial tissue. Hopefully this picture really demonstrates why this is the most protective of all of the epithelial tissues. The more cell layers that we have between the external environment and the internal environment, the more protected the underlying structures will be. Now here, we're going to see a section of the skin. We have the epidermis, which is shown up here at the top, the dermis, which is shown here, and then we do have a third layer known as the hypodermis. But this is not technically part of the skin, and we're not going to discuss much about the hypodermis. We want to give our focus to the epidermis and the dermis. And the first thing that you might notice from this slide is that the epidermis is a lot smaller than the dermis is. There is much more of the skin that's actually made up of the dermis, because the dermis is where we're going to house all of the blood vessels and all of the accessory structures that help give skin its function. We'll see here we have a hair follicle shown right here, and some different glandular tissue that we can find dispersed throughout the dermis also. While we are going to individually cover each of these accessory structures, we first need to break down the sublayers of the epidermis and the dermis. Now, the epidermis is going to have 5 sublayers, and the dermis is going to have 2 sublayers. So starting from superficial to deep, we're going to make our way into the epidermis. Now, I just said that the epidermis has 5 different layers, and that is true. But depending on where the skin actually is, it may have 4 layers. But it's always going to be a stratified squamous epithelium, and depending on where the skin is, we'll have 4 or 5 layers. The way that we'll distinguish this is based upon 2 different types of skin known as thick skin and thin skin. Just for your information, thick skin is found on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, and thin skin is going to be found everywhere else. So it's very important that you understand that. You will have to be able to distinguish the locations of thick skin and thin skin and which structures can be found housed within each. But we're going to assume that we're talking about thick skin, and we're going to start from superficial to deep. So actually, these are arranged deep to superficial. So I'm going to jump to the next slide so we can go from superficial to deep, and then make our way into the dermis layers, which we'll also discuss superficial to deep. So, the most superficial of all of the layers of the epidermis is the stratum corneum. This will be the most superficial. The stratum lucidum will be a little bit deeper than that. The stratum granulosum will be deeper than that. We'll have the stratum spinosum deeper, and then the deepest of all of the layers of the epidermis is the stratum basale. So I do apologize about the odd arrangement, but we're just going to start here and make our way backwards. The stratum corneum is the most superficial of all of the layers of the epidermis, and this layer is composed of many different keratinocytes, which are all going to be dead. There's between 20 and 30 layers of keratinocytes, but this number can change based on where that section of skin is found. The stratum corneum is going to be the layer of the epidermis that's actually contacting the external environment itself. Keratinocytes are our skin cells, so as they make their way up that stratified squamous epithelium, they're going to die off and provide a barrier for all of the structures that lay below them. So this is going to be our most superficial layer. Now just below this is a very special layer known as the stratum lucidum. The stratum lucidum is a very special layer because it's only found in thick skin. We will never have stratum lucidum in thin skin. So what we can infer from this is that the layer, the stratum lucidum, can only be found in the skin lining the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. The stratum lucidum will not be located anywhere else on the body. But this layer is very, very similar to the stratum corneum because it's just a few layers of dead keratinocytes as well. Because this is thick skin, these cells will be very, very highly keratinized. But the cells themselves are pretty much the same, and they'll only be found on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Now just deep to this, we have the stratum granulosum. And granulosum is the giveaway for what's going to be found in this layer. The stratum granulosum contains cytoplasmic granules. And granules are pigments that can be seen under the microscope. So cells that have a lot of granules will stain very darkly. And we'll see the stratum granulosum here in just a second on a microscopic section. But this stratum granulosum will be the last layer of the epidermis that contains live cells. The cells will be breaking down, and they're going to be dying. That's why we have the granules that can be found in the cells. But this will be one of the easier layers to point out, as those pigments inside of the cells will be an indicator that we're looking at this layer. So from superficial to deep, we have the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, and the stratum granulosum. The next deepest layer is the stratum spinosum, which is going to be a very, very lively layer within the epidermis. Here in the stratum spinosum, keratinocytes are still going to be dividing, and we're also going to find the Langerhans cell, also known as the intraepidermal macrophage, which you may learn a little bit more about in your lecture class, patrolling the integumentary system for foreign invaders. The stratum spinosum is a fairly deep layer of the epidermis, and it will also be the thickest of all of the layers in the epidermis as well. This layer is going to contain the projections of other cells known as melanocytes, which will produce and pass the pigment melanin onto the keratinocytes, for protection against ultraviolet light. The cells in the stratum spinosum are going to constantly make their way more superficial and eventually replace the cells in the stratum granulosum. Now, the last layer of the epidermis is the stratum basale, also known as the stratum germinativum, but I don't recommend that you learn this layer by this name. I will always refer to this layer as the stratum basale, and I think this name is a bit more appropriate because this will be the most basal of all the layers, hence why we call it the stratum basale. Now, this layer is going to be quite unique because this is only a single layer of cells. There's going to be stem cells found in this layer, as well as the melanocytes that are producing melanin. These cells will be actively dividing and giving rise to the rest of the cells in the epidermis. So all in all, from superficial to deep, we have the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. This is, of course, in thick skin. In thin skin, we will not have the stratum lucidum. But that being mentioned, I'd be quite impressed if your head is not spinning with all of the information that we've just gone through. It can definitely be a challenge to remember the order of each of these layers of the epidermis. And I experienced that same feeling when I was learning these layers of the epidermis myself. I happened to go to my lecture class, and my instructor taught us these different layers of the epidermis, and then told us we had a test on the entire integumentary system the following day. So I went home quite stressed out, wondering how I was going to ever remember all of these layers and in what order they occur. So I got creative. I made up a little mnemonic that I'm going to share with you all that will describe the layers of the epidermis from superficial to deep. You do what you've got to do to make sure that you get a good grade on your tests. So, using the first letter of the second word of each of these layers, we have C, L, G, S, and B. So the mnemonic goes, Chester loves grabbing some booty. I'll tell you, ever since I came up with that one, I have never forgotten the order of the layers of the epidermis. So I hope that little mnemonic serves each of you well in making sure that you can remember these layers in their order. Here on this slide, you can see a section of the epidermis specifically. We have the stratum corneum, which can be shown up here, which has many different dead keratinocytes. Just below this, we'll have the stratum lucidum, found right here, which is a little hard to see. But just under that, we're going to have that stratum granulosum, which is where we're going to have those cytoplasmic granules and cells that have started to degrade. Here we'll find the stratum spinosum, and then we have that single layer, the stratum basale, which can be found here at the base, which will be contacting the dermis. So that pretty much sums up what we need to know about the epidermis. Now, just below the epidermis, we also have the dermis, which is going to be the next layer that we're going to discuss. Fortunately, the dermis only has 2 layers, not 5, and these layers happen to be ordered alphabetically. So I don't have any clever trick for remembering these layers, I just remember that they're alphabetical. So the dermis's 2 layers are the papillary layer, as well as the reticular layer. The papillary layer is going to be the more superficial of the 2 layers, and it's going to contain dermal papillae. These are wavy, finger-like projections inside of this papillary layer that will be found especially in the hands and in the feet. The dermal papillae are going to give rise to our fingerprints. These are going to pull down on the epidermis and produce epidermal ridges. So this is a very unique and fun fact here about the papillary layer. There is one other fact about the papillary layer, and I'll mention that when we get there. But for now, I just need you to understand that this is the more superficial of the 2 layers of the dermis, and it's going to contain dermal papillae that give rise to the fingerprints. Now, the reticular layer is where most of the structures are going to be found within the dermis. This is a much larger layer than the papillary layer is. You can see here that we'll have most of our blood vessels here found in the dermis. And it makes sense that we're going to have blood vessels here, because this is a connective tissue, which is vascular. It is epithelial tissue that is avascular, so there won't be any blood vessels coursing through the epidermis, but blood vessels will be heavily found here in the dermis. Now we'll also find in the reticular layer sweat glands and sebaceous glands, and we're going to find pressure receptors, which help for our general sense of touch. Hair follicles start to arise in the reticular layer, and we're going to see some examples of that moving forward. But first and foremost, what we can see is that the epidermis is going to end here with the stratum basale. And right here, we're going to have the papillary layer of the dermis. You can see these waves are the dermal papillae. So these are going to give rise to the epidermal ridges. The reticular layer is going to be found right down here, and we have lots and lots of other things that can be found housed within this layer. You'll find the layers of the epidermis up here as well, in case you'd like a reference that uses both the epidermis and the dermis. So I think this is a little bit better of a picture for us to look at, so let's go ahead and see what's going on here within the skin. First and foremost, you can see the epidermis shown right here. We've got the stratum corneum shown over here. We'll have the stratum granulosum shown right here, and we're going to have the stratum spinosum shown right here. These wave-like structures in here are going to be referring to the dermal papillae. And here we have that papillary layer of the dermis, which is of course where we're going to find those. You'll see in certain locations they're going to pull down on the epidermis and give rise to the fingerprints. But all this is taking place very, very superficially. Here deep to the papillary layer is going to be the reticular layer. And the reticular layer is going to contain not only blood vessels, but it's also going to contain our hair follicles, glandular tissue, as well as the sensory receptors. You can see here a sudoriferous sweat gland found right here in the reticular layer. I'll show you some sebaceous glands very shortly, and some hair follicles that will be associated. Most of the accessory structures are in fact housed here within the reticular layer. And right up here, you'll see an example of the sensory receptor. You'll talk about the Pacinian corpuscle much more in Anatomy and Physiology 2, but this is an example of a sensory receptor found within the integumentary system. So, we're going to start breaking down the accessory structures that are housed within that reticular layer of the dermis. As I've already mentioned, there's two different types of glands, the sebaceous glands and the sudoriferous glands. Each of these glands can be found in different concentrations in different parts of the skin, and certain glands will be associated with certain other structures. Let's jump in here to the oil gland first. The sebaceous glands can be found in all thin skin, but they will not be found in any of the thick skin. So sebaceous glands are found everywhere with the exception of the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Now, one of the most important things I'm going to tell you here about sebaceous glands is that all sebaceous glands are associated with hair follicles. They will dump sebum into the hair follicles, and wherever hair follicles are present, sebaceous glands will be present as well. This will be very useful to you when you're trying to identify different types of glands. If you see a hair follicle next to it, it's automatically going to be assumed to be a sebaceous gland. So this picture here demonstrates what I mean. This large structure is the hair follicle, and the sebaceous gland can be found right next to it. Sebaceous glands are very light and puffy, and it looks as if these cells are quite plump and filled up with secretory products. The sebaceous gland sort of characteristically looks like one large mass, and that is not how our sudoriferous glands are going to look. The sudoriferous glands are the sweat glands, and we will in fact have two different types of these. We have the eccrine sweat glands and the apocrine sweat glands. But fortunately, you will not have to distinguish eccrine sweat glands from apocrine sweat glands. You'll only need to be able to distinguish sudoriferous sweat glands from sebaceous oil glands. So let's discuss where we can find each of these two sudoriferous glands. Eccrine sweat glands are the sweat glands that we think about in terms of thermal regulation. When you go outside and it's very warm, you start to sweat. Those are going to be the eccrine sweat glands that will be active. They're important for thermal regulation because when our body gets warm, we're going to sweat, and sweat will be evaporated off the body and take the heat with it. So eccrine sweat glands are distributed all over the body. They're going to be found in both thick skin and in thin skin. Now, apocrine sweat glands, on the other hand, are very, very specific. These are going to secrete sweat whenever we're stressed, and these are only found in the axilla, or the armpit region, as well as the genital regions as well. So you'll see an example of a sudoriferous gland shown right here. And sudoriferous glands sort of represent a long coiled tube that's very tortuous and folded up in the reticular layer of the dermis. When we take a section of one of these sudoriferous glands, we're going to see a picture that looks something like this. We have lots and lots of different circles that can be found over here, which are representing a long tube that's coiled up and secreting sweat. These will not be associated with hair follicles. So if you don't see a hair follicle next to it, we're probably going to be looking here at a sudoriferous gland. Sweat glands are in fact exocrine glands, so this will be a simple cuboidal epithelium that's going to be lining and making up this gland. So in review, we have lots of different structures that we've discussed thus far. First and foremost, it's very important that we keep in mind where all of these structures can be found. So thick skin is going to be found in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Thin skin will be found everywhere else. The stratum lucidum of the epidermis is only going to be found on the thick skin. So that's only on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. But with this, we're going to have eccrine sweat glands that are distributed all over the body. We're going to have hair follicles, which are only found in thin skin and will always be associated with sebaceous glands. And then the apocrine sweat glands are only found in the genital regions as well as the axilla. Now, to elaborate on one of our other accessory structures, we also have hair that's part of the integumentary system too. Hair, as I just discussed, is found all over the body with the exception of the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. We also will, of course, not find hair on the nipples, lips, and at parts of the external genitalia, but it's the thick skin that I really want you to understand that hair will not be found. Hair is going to be found everywhere that sebaceous glands will be found, and sebaceous glands will be found everywhere that hair is found, and those are going to be on the thin skin. Each hair is going to have a shaft and the part at the bottom which is known as the root. You can see here on this slide a hair follicle shown right here and an associated sebaceous gland that's going to be secreting sebum into this hair duct. You'll see another hair follicle shown here and some sebaceous glands that are found close to this one as well. Down here we're going to have a sudoriferous gland which is going to be much more coiled and not associated with hair follicles. Now the last accessory structure that we're going to introduce is the erector pili muscle. If you remember, I said that there's two things that I'll need you to know about the papillary layer of the dermis, and the erector pili is going to be the second. The erector pili muscle is in fact a smooth muscle, and these will also be associated with the hair follicles. Each erector pili muscle is going to attach to the base of every single hair follicle and also attach to the papillary layer of the dermis. When the erector pili muscle contracts, that's going to make those hairs stand upright, and that's where we get goosebumps. So everything you need to know about the papillary layer of the dermis is fingerprints and goosebumps. Here you can see the erector pili muscle, and so when this muscle contracts, that's going to pull the base of the hair follicle over this way, and that's going to make the shaft of the hair stand upright. And naturally, we're going to have that sebaceous gland that's associated with the hair follicle right here. We'll have the sweat or sudoriferous gland shown right here. All of this is found here within the reticular layer of the dermis. Now lastly here for the skin, we're going to discuss the classification of burns. I'm sure you guys have heard of first-degree burns, second-degree burns, and third-degree burns before. But the way that we classify these is very, very specific and based upon the different layers of skin that are affected by the burn. My first suggestion to you all is that on the quiz, please don't select fourth-degree burns. There is no such thing as a fourth-degree burn. So make sure you know how to distinguish these three from each other and that there are only these three. So, of course, first and foremost is the first-degree burn. When the epidermis alone is damaged, that's going to be classified as a first-degree burn. A sunburn would be an example of this. When you get sunburn, that's going to affect the epidermis, and therefore you get the peeling of skin as the epidermal cells are shedding off and replacing themselves. Now the second degree burns are going to be when the epidermis is completely damaged and the upper portion of the dermis is damaged as well. Most often with second degree burns, we'll see blisters as the epidermis will separate from the dermis. So blisters are a good mark to classify as second degree burn. Third degree burns, lastly, are going to be when the entire epidermis and the entire dermis have been destroyed in the burn. With a third degree burn, the hypodermis is left exposed, and this will be, of course, the most severe out of all three.